Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your quiz master, Sean, and I've got questions for you. Questions for the baby boomers. Part 2. Now, what we're going to cover is history, entertainment, sports, inventions, any stuff that happened that the baby boomers should remember. And the rest of us, we can have fun learning, if not seeing what we remember from listening to our parents and paying attention in school. Well, anyway, let's see what we know and what we remember. Have fun doing it. Remember, this keeps us young. All right, enough of me yakking. Let's get to it. Question number 1. Which iconic Broadway musical premiered in 1957 and featured the song Tonight? The Music Man, The King and I, or West Side Story? That was West Side Story. What was the first portable stereo system, popularly known as a boombox, introduced in 1966? Was it the Sony TCD5, the Philips Dynamic 60, or the Panasonic RS 485S? The Panasonic RS 485S. Which novel by Harper Lee, published in 1960, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction? To Kill a Mockingbird, The Caine Mutiny, or A Separate Piece? And that novel was To Kill a Mockingbird. What was the original name of the handheld electronic game Simon before its commercial release in 1978? Was it Follow Me, Touch Me, or Echo? The original name was Touch Me. I think Simon's better. Which 1950s automotive design feature was known as Dagmars? Tail fins, chrome bumper protrusions, or fender skirts? And that was chrome bumper protrusions. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric toothbrush introduced in 1961? Broxident, Interplaque, or Sonicare? The first successful commercial toothbrush was Broxident. Which 1971 film featured Malcolm McDowell as Alex, a violent delinquent subjected to experimental psychology conditioning? Was that a Clockwork Orange, Deliverance, or Straw Dogs? That was A Clockwork Orange. What was the name of the controversial 1948 book by Alfred Kinsey that shocked America with its findings on human sexual behavior? Was it The Joy of Sex, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, or Human Sexual Response? That book was Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Which famous television commercial, aired only once during the 1984 Super Bowl, introduced the Apple Macintosh computer? 1984, Think Different, or Welcome, IBM? And that was 1984. What was the name of the first commercial motel chain founded in 1925, but experiencing explosive growth in the 1950s? Was it Holiday Inn, Motel 6, or the Alamo Plaza Hotel Courts? Alamo Plaza Hotel Courts. Which 1962 instrumental by The Tornadoes became the first song by a British group to reach number 1 on the U.S. charts? Was it Walk Don't Run, Wipeout, or Telstar? That instrumental was Telstar. What was the original purpose of bubble wrap when it was invented in 1957? Was it a packaging material, a textured wallpaper, or a children's toy? Bubble wrap was originally textured wallpaper. Which social activist founded the Grey Panthers in 1970 to combat ageism and advocate for elderly rights? Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, or Maggie Kuhn? The Grey Panthers, that was Maggie Kuhn. What was the first mass-market personal finance software program released in 1983? QuickBooks, Microsoft Money, or Quicken? The first one was Quicken. Which 1950s film studio process created a wider screen image by compressing the picture horizontally during filming and expanding it during projection? Technicolor, Panavision, or CinemaScope? And that process was CinemaScope. What was the original name of the company that would become Nike when it was founded in 1964? Was that Blue Ribbon Sports, Athletics West, or Tiger Running? The original name of Nike was Blue Ribbon Sports. Which 1958 novel by Leon Uris tells the story of the founding of Israel through several fictional characters? Was that Trinity, Mila 18, or Exodus? And that was Exodus. What was the first commercially successful electric food processor introduced in 1973? Cuisinart, KitchenAid, or Hamilton Beach? And that first one was Cuisinart. Which 1957 film starred Andy Griffith as a charismatic drifter who becomes a television personality and political demagogue? A Face in the Crowd, No Time for Sergeants, or Elmer Gantry? A Face in the Crowd. What was the first widely available home air conditioning unit introduced in 1951? Frigidaire Thriftier, the Philco Power Plant, or the General Electric Thin Line? It was the General Electric Thin Line. Which civil rights activist was the founder of the National Farm Workers Association, later United Farm Workers, in 1962? Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, or Humberto Garcia? It was Cesar Chavez. What was the first credit card to feature a magnetic stripe introduced in 1969? American Express, MasterCharge, or was it Discover? And the first one with a magnetic strip was MasterCharge. Which 1955 film featured James Dean as troubled teenager Jim Stark? East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, or Giant? And that film was Rebel Without a Cause. What was the name of the first commercially successful laundry detergent specifically formulated for automatic washers introduced in 1946? Tide, Cheer, or Fab? And that was Tide. Which 1960s artist was known as the King of Pop Art and created the Campbell's Soup Can series? Was that Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, or Andy Warhol? That was the work of Andy Warhol. What was the name of the first successful commercial hairspray introduced in 1948? Aquanet, Brill Cream, or was it Helene Curtis Spraynet? It was Helene Curtis Spraynet. Which 1960 film, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, revolutionized horror films with its shocking shower scene? Vertigo, Psycho, or was it The Birds? It was Psycho. What was the first successful consumer camcorder that recorded directly to VHS tapes, introduced in 1984? The Sony Handycam, the JVC GRC1, or the RCA CLR 200? It was the JVC GRC1. Which 1950s magazine became controversial for its candid discussions of sexuality and featured the first centerfold? Was that Esquire, Life, or Playboy? It was Playboy. What was the first commercially successful cordless power drill, introduced in 1961? Black & Decker, Makita, or was it DeWalt? And it was Black & Decker. Which book by Betty Friedan, published in 1963, is credited with sparking second-wave feminism? The Second Sex, The Feminine Mystique, or Born Female? Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. What was the first commercially successful home treadmill, introduced in 1968? Was it Nordic Track, Pace Master, or the McLevy Health Products? It was McLevy Health Products. Which 1959 novel by William S. Burroughs used the cut-up technique and became a defining work of the Beat Generation? On the Road, Naked Lunch, or Howl? It was Naked Lunch. What was the first commercially successful household air freshener, introduced in 1948? Was it Glade, Airwick, or Lysol? And that would be Airwick. Which television journalist gained fame for his confrontational CBS interviews and his 1968 debate with Gore Vidal? Was it Mike Wallace, Dan Rather, or William F. Buckley Jr.? It was William F. Buckley Jr. What was the first commercially successful disposable lighter, introduced in 1972? Was it Zippo, Cricket, or Bic? The first one was Bic. Which 1972 film, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, featured the line, "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse"? Was it The Conversation, The Godfather, or Patton? It was The Godfather. What was the first mass-produced car with a fiberglass body, introduced in 1953? Was it the Chevrolet Corvette, the Ford Thunderbird, or the Kaiser Darren? It was the Chevrolet Corvette. Which 1960s architectural movement was characterized by exposed structural elements and raw concrete surfaces? Brutalism, postmodernism, or deconstructivism? It was brutalism. What was the first commercially successful home espresso machine, introduced in 1938, but achieving mass popularity in the 1950s? La Pavoni Europiccola, Faima E61, or the Belletti Mocha Express? You see that. Which musical festival held in the UK from 1970 to 1976 featured performances by Led Zeppelin, The Who, and Pink Floyd? The Reading Festival, the Isle of Wight Festival, or the Knebworth Festival? It was the Knebworth Festival. What was the first successful commercial non-dairy creamer, introduced in 1953? Was it Coffee Mate, Coffee Rich, or Preem? It was Preem. Which 1963 novel by Kurt Vonnegut features the character Billy Pilgrim, who becomes unstuck in time? Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five, or Mother Night? It was Slaughterhouse-Five. What was the first commercially successful personal organizer, or PDA, introduced in 1984? Was it the Palm Pilot, the Sharp Wizard, or the Scion Organizer? The first one was the Scion Organizer. Which 1950s rock and roll pioneer was known as The Killer and had hits with Great Balls of Fire and Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On? Was that Little Richard, Chuck Berry, or Jerry Lee Lewis? Great Balls of Fire, it's Jerry Lee Lewis. What was the first commercially successful compact disc player introduced in 1982? The Sony CDP-101, the Philips CD-100, or the Pioneer PD-70? The first commercially successful compact disc player was the Sony CDP-101. Which 1973 film starred Al Pacino as Frank Serpico, a New York City police officer who exposed corruption? Was it Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, or And Justice for All? It was Serpico. Serpico? What was the first successful commercial dry pet food introduced in 1956? Purina Dog Chow, Kennel Ration, or was it Gaines Burgers? It was Purina Dog Chow. Which 1957 novel by Jack Kerouac became a defining work of the Beat Generation? Was it The Dharma Bums, On the Road, or The Subterraneans? It was On the Road. What was the first commercially successful electronic keyboard instrument that could reproduce the sound of various orchestral instruments? Was it the Mellotron, the Hammond organ, or the Yamaha DX7? It was the Mellotron. Which 1972 documentary film by Barbara Koppel chronicled a violent coal miners' strike in Harlan County, Kentucky? Hearts and Minds, The War Room, or Harlan County, USA? That film was Harlan County, USA. What was the first widely used spreadsheet program released in 1979? Was it Lotus 123, Microsoft Excel, or was it VisiCalc? It was VisiCalc. Which 1958 novel by Truman Capote tells the story of Holly Golightly, an eccentric New York socialite? Breakfast at Tiffany's, In Cold Blood, or The Grass Harp? It was Breakfast at Tiffany's. What was the first commercially successful sports drink formulated in 1965? Was it Powerade, Gatorade, or 10K? And that first one was Gatorade. Which 1967 film starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway glamorized the lives of depressed-era bank robbers? The Sting, The Wild Bunch, or Bonnie and Clyde? It was Bonnie and Clyde. What was the first commercially successful electronic word processor introduced in 1976? Was it the Wing 1200, the Xerox Star, or was it WordStar? And that was the Wing 1200. Which 1962 album by Bob Dylan featured the songs Blowin' in the Wind and A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall? Was it Highway 61 Revisited, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, or Bringing It All Back Home? It was The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. What was the first commercially successful handheld electronic game introduced in 1976? Was it Mattel Auto Race, Merlin, or Game & Watch? The first one was Mattel Auto Race. Which 1950s comedian created the character of the Poor Soul and was known for his talk-to-the-audience technique? Was it Jackie Gleason, Red Skelton, or Sid Caesar? And that was Red Skelton. What was the first commercially successful electronic digital watch introduced in 1972? Was it the Pulsar Time Computer, the Seiko Quartz LC, or the Casio Data Bank? It was the Pulsar Time Computer. Which 1961 novel by Joseph Heller introduced the concept of a Catch-22 situation? Slaughterhouse-Five, The Naked and the Dead, or was it simply Catch-22? It was Catch-22. What was the first commercially successful home blood pressure monitor introduced in 1973? Was it the Omron, LifeScan, or the Lumiscope? It was Lumiscope. Which 1965 film directed by David Lean featured Omar Sharif as Yuri Zhivago? Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, or was it A Passage to India? It was Dr. Zhivago. What was the first commercially successful wireless remote control for televisions introduced in 1956? Was it the Zenith Space Command, the Philips Telecommander, or the Sony Commander? It was the Zenith Space Command. Which 1950s jazz musician was known as Bird and helped develop bebop? Dizzy Gillespie, or was it Thelonious Monk, or maybe Charlie Parker? It was Charlie Parker. What was the first commercially successful automatic coffee maker for home use introduced in 1972? Was it Mr. Coffee, the Braun Aeromaster, or the Krups Brewmaster? It was Mr. Coffee. Which 1961 film starring Audrey Hepburn featured the song Moon River? Was it Roman Holiday, My Fair Lady, or was it Breakfast at Tiffany's? And that was Breakfast at Tiffany's. What was the first commercially successful electronic home alarm system introduced in 1966? Was it the ADT SafeWatch, Honeywell Security, or Ademco? It was Ademco. Which 1968 science fiction novel by Philip K. Dick was later adapted into the film Blade Runner? Was it A Scanner Darkly, Ubik, or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep? Sheep? Electric sheep? Do androids dream of electric sheep? What was the first commercially successful permanent hair color for home use, introduced in 1956? Clairol Miss Clairol, L'Oreal Preference, or Revlon Color Silk? It was Clairol Miss Clairol. Which 1967 film, directed by Arthur Penn, was one of the first to feature graphic violence in mainstream American cinema? Was it The Wild Bunch, Bonnie and Clyde, or was it In Cold Blood? It was Bonnie and Clyde. What was the first commercially successful food processor introduced in America in 1973? Was it the KitchenAid, the Cuisinart, or the Sunbeam Mixmaster? It was the Cuisinart. Which 1953 novel by Ray Bradbury depicts a dystopian society where books are outlawed? Was it Something Wicked This Way Comes, The Martian Chronicles, or Fahrenheit 451? It was Fahrenheit 451. What was the first commercially successful home video game that could be played on multiple arcade games? Was it Space Invaders, Phoenix, or Universal System? And the first one was Universal System. Which 1950s television personality hosted Person to Person, interviewing celebrities in their homes? Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite, or Jack Parr? And that was Edward R. Murrow. What was the first successful commercial frozen dinner introduced in 1954? Was it Banquin, Swanson TV Dinner, or Stouffer's? The first one was the Swanson TV Dinner. Which 1955 film, directed by Nicholas Ray, starred James Dean as a troubled teenager? East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, or Giant? And that film was Rebel Without a Cause. What was the first commercially successful automatic garage door opener for residential use, introduced in 1954? Was it Genie, Chamberlain, or Alliance Manufacturing? It was Alliance Manufacturing. Which 1956 musical starring Yul Brynner and Deborah Kerr featured the song Shall We Dance? Oklahoma, South Pacific, or was it The King and I? That was The King and I. What was the first commercially successful electric carving knife introduced in 1963? Was it Rival, Sunbeam, or was it Hamilton Beach? The first one was Rival. And you've done an amazing job. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And share your score in the comments, please. And check out these videos right here. They're a lot of fun too. And we like making them and playing with you. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.